The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Jake Morrison's weathered pickup truck as he pulled up to what could generously be called the most dilapidated structure in Tombstone County. For $10, the price of a decent lunch, he'd just purchased what the county assessor had listed as uninhabitable dwelling, condemned. The wooden shack leaned precariously to one side, its tin roof more holes than metal, and the front porch had collapsed entirely. Jake figured he'd use it for firewood, maybe clear the lot and sell it to some city developer looking for authentic Old West atmosphere. He never imagined that stepping through that rotting doorframe would plunge him into a mystery that would challenge everything he thought he knew about justice, survival, and the forgotten corners of American history. The wind whistled through gaps in the weathered planks as Jake approached the structure, his boots crunching on broken glass and debris. This wasn't his first rodeo buying distressed property. He'd been flipping houses and land parcels across the Southwest for 15 years, ever since his divorce left him with nothing but his truck and an eye for undervalued real estate. But something about this place felt different. Maybe it was the way the locals in town had gone quiet when he mentioned the address, or how the previous owner had practically thrown the deed at him before disappearing into the desert. Whatever it was, Jake Morrison was about to discover that some bargains come with a price that can't be measured in dollars. As he pushed open the creaking door, expecting to find nothing but dust, decay, and maybe a family of rattlesnakes, Jake's world turned upside down. There, huddled in the far corner of what had once been a living room, were 10 women. Not just any women. These were clearly refugees, their clothes travel-worn and faces etched with exhaustion and fear. They ranged in age from teenagers to elderly, each carrying the unmistakable look of people who had traveled far and suffered much. Their eyes met his with a mixture of terror and desperate hope, and in that moment, Jake realized his $10 investment had just complicated his life beyond anything he could have imagined. The oldest woman, her gray hair braided with colorful threads that spoke of traditions from another country, stepped forward cautiously. Her English was broken but determined as she explained their situation. They had been traveling for months, following a route that smugglers had promised would lead them to safety and work in the American interior. But their guide had abandoned them here 3 days ago, taking their money and leaving them with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a rapidly dwindling supply of water. The shack had provided shelter from the brutal desert nights, but they knew it was only a matter of time before someone discovered them, or worse, before thirst and exposure claimed their lives. Jake stood there, keys still in his hand, trying to process the situation. These weren't just trespassers on his newly acquired property, they were human beings in crisis, and their fate now rested squarely on his shoulders. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to call Border Patrol, to wash his hands of a situation that could land him in serious legal trouble. But looking into their faces, seeing the quiet dignity with which they faced their desperate circumstances, Jake felt something stir within him that he hadn't experienced in years. These women had crossed impossible distances, faced unimaginable dangers, and now found themselves trapped in a limbo between their old lives and dreams of something better. The youngest of the group, a girl who couldn't have been more than 16, clutched a photograph of what appeared to be her family back home. Her story, translated through the older woman, who seemed to serve as their informal leader, painted a picture of violence and poverty that had driven them from their homes in search of basic safety. She had been studying to become a teacher when the cartel wars reached her village, forcing her family to make the impossible choice between staying and risking death, or fleeing into an uncertain future. Her parents had scraped together everything they owned to pay for her passage north, praying that education and hard work would give her the life they could never provide. But it wasn't just personal tragedy that had brought these women together in this unlikely sanctuary. Each had a story that spoke to larger forces reshaping the borderland's economic collapse, political violence, environmental disasters that had turned once fertile farmland into barren wasteland. The middle-aged woman with calloused hands had been a seamstress whose factory closed when American companies moved their operations even further south to countries with cheaper labor. The elderly woman who moved with painful slowness had been caring for grandchildren, whose parents had already made the dangerous journey north, only to disappear somewhere in the vast desert between hope and reality. Jake found himself drawn into their stories despite every instinct telling him to maintain distance. These weren't the faceless statistics he read about in newspapers or heard debated on talk radio. They were individuals with names, dreams, and an unshakable belief that somewhere beyond the horizon lay a chance for something better. Their leader, who introduced herself as Alina, had been a nurse in her home country, and Jake watched as she tenderly cared for the others, rationing their precious water supply and treating minor injuries with the few medical supplies they had managed to carry on their journey. As the first day turned into evening, Jake realized he was facing a decision that would define not just his immediate future, but his very character. The women had nowhere else to go, no resources to continue their journey, and no legal status that would protect them if discovered by authorities. Yet harboring undocumented immigrants was a federal crime that could result in years in prison, and the loss of everything he had worked to rebuild after his personal and financial collapse. The abandoned shack that had seemed like such a simple investment opportunity had become the center of a moral storm that would test every principle he claimed to hold dear. The practical challenges were overwhelming. 10 people needed food, water, medical attention, and basic sanitation facilities in a structure that barely qualified as shelter. The nearest town was 20 miles away across rough desert terrain, and any supplies he purchased would need to be explained to curious neighbors and shopkeepers who knew everyone's business in this sparse corner of Arizona. Moreover, the women couldn't stay hidden indefinitely. Eventually, someone would notice unusual activity around the supposedly abandoned property, or law enforcement would conduct one of their routine patrols through the area. Alina approached him as he sat on the collapsed porch, staring out at the sunset painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Her English, while limited, carried the weight of experience and wisdom earned through hardship. She didn't ask him for anything directly, but simply shared her story of the journey that had brought her to this place. She had been working in a clinic that provided healthcare to the poorest members of her community when violence erupted between rival factions seeking control of the drug trade. Healthcare workers, she explained, were often targeted because they treated everyone, regardless of affiliation, making them valuable assets that different groups wanted to control or eliminate. The decision to leave hadn't been made lightly. Alina had family, friends, and a position of respect in her community, but when threats against her life became specific and credible, when colleagues began disappearing and the clinic was attacked twice in 1 month, staying became synonymous with suicide. The journey north had taken everything she owned and tested every limit of human endurance. But she had survived by focusing on a simple goal, reaching a place where she could practice medicine again, where healing didn't make her a target for violence. Jake listened to her story and found himself thinking about his own journey to this moment. His life hadn't been easy either, though his challenges paled in comparison to what these women had endured. The divorce had left him bitter and isolated, and the years of struggling to rebuild his finances had taught him to think primarily about his own survival. But sitting there in the gathering darkness, listening to Alina describe her determination to create a new life built on service to others, Jake began to question the walls he had built around his heart and his sense of responsibility to something larger than himself. The other women gradually joined them on the porch, and Jake found himself learning their names and stories. Maria, the teenage girl with dreams of teaching, had taught herself English by reading discarded American textbooks that somehow made their way to her village. Carmen, a woman in her 30s, had been supporting her disabled brother and elderly mother by working multiple jobs until economic collapse made even survival wages impossible to find. Rosa, whose arthritic hands spoke of decades of hard labor, had raised 8 children and was now trying to reunite with the 3 who had already made it to the United States years earlier. As the night deepened and the desert temperature dropped, Jake made his first concrete decision. He drove to town and purchased basic supplies, food, water, blankets, and a portable camping stove. He told the store clerk he was planning an extended camping trip in the mountains, a story that would explain future purchases and his need for supplies designed to sustain multiple people in primitive conditions. It was a small step, but it represented his first active choice to help rather than simply avoid making the situation worse. Returning to the shack, Jake found the women had organized themselves with remarkable efficiency. They had cleaned the interior as much as possible, arranged sleeping areas that provided maximum warmth and privacy, and established a system for rationing water that would extend their supply for several more days. Their ability to maintain hope and dignity under such circumstances impressed him and began to challenge his assumptions about resilience and character. These weren't helpless victims waiting for rescue. They were survivors who had already overcome obstacles that would have defeated many people born into more privileged circumstances. The conversation that night, conducted in a mixture of English and Spanish with generous use of gestures and drawings in the dust, revealed the complexity of their situation. Some of the women had family members already in the United States who were frantically searching for them. Others were completely alone, having left behind everyone they had ever known in pursuit of safety and opportunity. All of them understood that their legal status made them vulnerable to exploitation, detention, and deportation, but they also possessed an unshakable belief that their courage and willingness to work hard would eventually create opportunities for meaningful lives. Alina shared her dream of working in a clinic that served immigrant communities, using her medical training to help others navigate the challenges she now faced herself. Maria talked about her plans to attend college and become a teacher, convinced that education was the key to breaking cycles of poverty and violence. Carmen hoped to find work that would allow her to send money home to her family while building a foundation for bringing them safely to join her. Each woman carried not just personal dreams, but a sense of responsibility to those they had left behind and those who might follow their path. Jake realized that his decision about what to do with his unexpected house guests would affect far more than just the 10 women currently sheltering in his dilapidated shack. Their families back home were counting on their success to provide remittances and eventually sponsor other family members. Future migrants were watching to see whether the routes and methods that had brought these women this far could be trusted, and somewhere in the network of people who helped migrants navigate the dangerous journey north, others were waiting to learn whether the safe house they had identified actually provided the security it promised. The weight of these interconnected expectations and dependencies was staggering. Jake had never considered himself a person whose decisions could ripple outward to affect hundreds or thousands of other lives. He was just a divorced real estate speculator trying to rebuild his financial security by finding undervalued properties and maximizing their potential. But the arbitrary circumstance of purchasing this particular piece of land for $10 had thrust him into a position where his choices would determine not just the immediate fate of 10 women, but potentially influence the trajectory of entire families and communities across multiple countries. That as he lay on the hard ground that first night, using his jacket as a pillow and listening to the quiet breathing of people whose names he was still learning to pronounce, Jake stared up at the brilliant desert stars and tried to imagine how his life had taken such an unexpected turn. 20 hours earlier, his biggest concern had been whether he could flip this property quickly enough to pay for the truck repairs he had been postponing. Now he was harboring 10 undocumented immigrants in a structure that could collapse at any moment, making decisions that could land him in federal prison while simultaneously determining whether 10 brave women would survive to pursue their dreams or disappear into the vast machinery of detention and deportation. The morning brought new challenges and revelations. Elena's medical training became invaluable when she examined the other women and identified several serious health concerns that required immediate attention. Rosa's arthritis was severely aggravated by sleeping on the ground, and her pain levels were affecting her ability to move safely. Carmen had developed what appeared to be a respiratory infection that was worsening in the dusty environment of the dilapidated shack. Most concerning, the youngest member of their group, 16-year-old Maria, was showing signs of severe dehydration and exhaustion that suggested her body was beginning to shut down from the accumulated stress of their journey. Jake found himself becoming Elena's assistant as she improvised medical care using limited supplies and improvised equipment. He drove to 3 different towns to purchase over-the-counter medications, bandages, and nutritional supplements without arousing suspicion, telling different stories at each location to explain his needs. The experience of watching Elena work reinforced his growing recognition that these women brought valuable skills and knowledge that could benefit any community lucky enough to welcome them. Her ability to diagnose and treat medical conditions with minimal resources demonstrated exactly the kind of practical expertise that rural areas like this desperately needed. The logistics of caring for 10 people in a structure without running water, electricity, or proper sanitation quickly became overwhelming. Jake rigged a solar panel system to provide basic lighting and the ability to charge essential devices. He installed a temporary water storage system and arranged for discreet delivery of supplies through a network of back roads that avoided the main highways where Border Patrol maintained checkpoints. Each solution created new challenges. The solar panels were visible from the air. The increased traffic to the property might attract attention, and the growing stockpile of supplies would be difficult to explain if discovered by authorities. But the most significant challenge wasn't logistical, it was emotional. Jake found himself becoming deeply invested in the outcomes of individual women, whose circumstances had thrown them together in this unlikely refuge. He learned that Maria's father had been killed by cartel members who were attempting to recruit young men from their village, and that her mother had sold the family's small plot of land to pay for her daughter's journey north. The photograph Maria clutched wasn't just a memento, it was the last image she would ever have of a family that had sacrificed everything to give her a chance at survival and success. Carmen's story revealed the devastating impact of economic policies that had destroyed traditional industries and left entire communities without viable means of supporting themselves. She had worked in a factory that produced goods for export to the United States. But when trade agreements changed and production moved to countries with even lower labor costs, thousands of workers found themselves unemployed with no prospects for finding comparable employment. Her journey north wasn't driven by dreams of prosperity, but by the simple need to find work that would allow her to support her disabled brother and aging mother, who depended entirely on her income. Rosa's presence in the group spoke to the heartbreaking reality of family separation that characterized so many migration stories. 3 of her children had made successful journeys to the United States over the previous decade, establishing themselves in various communities and sending money home to support the family members who remained behind. But as conditions in their home region continued to deteriorate, Rosa had made the difficult decision to attempt the dangerous journey herself, hoping to reunite with her children and help care for the grandchildren she had never met. At her age, the physical demands of crossing the desert were nearly impossible, but the alternative, remaining alone in a place where violence and poverty were destroying everything she had worked to build, seemed even worse. Each story Jake heard reinforced his understanding that the women sheltering in his shack weren't making frivolous choices or seeking easy opportunities. They were responding to circumstances that had made staying home synonymous with accepting defeat, violence, or death. Their courage in undertaking such a dangerous journey spoke to the strength of their commitment to survival and their belief in the possibility of building better lives through hard work and determination. But it also highlighted the desperation that drove people to risk everything on the slim chance that they might find safety and opportunity in a country that was increasingly hostile to their presence. As days turned into weeks, Jake's temporary solution began to evolve into something more permanent and complex. The women had transformed the interior of the shack into a surprisingly livable space, using their combined skills to address structural problems and create functional areas for cooking, sleeping, and maintaining privacy. Elena had established a makeshift medical clinic in one corner, treating not only her fellow travelers but also providing basic health care to Jake when he injured his back while reinforcing the roof. Maria had begun teaching English lessons to the older women while improving her own language skills by reading every book and magazine Jake could provide. The sense of community that developed within the confines of the small structure was unlike anything Jake had experienced in his adult life. These women, thrown together by circumstance and united by shared challenges, had created a support system that addressed not just material needs but emotional and spiritual ones as well. They shared cooking duties, took turns caring for Rosa when her arthritis flared, and maintained a schedule of activities that provided structure and purpose to their days. Their ability to find joy and meaning in the smallest pleasures, a successful meal prepared on the camping stove, a beautiful sunset viewed from the reinforced porch, a song sung together in the evening, reminded Jake of aspects of human experience he had forgotten during his years of focusing solely on financial survival. But the idyllic aspects of their temporary community couldn't obscure the fundamental unsustainability of their situation. The women needed legal status, permanent housing, access to healthcare, and opportunities to work and contribute to society. The shack, despite their improvements, remained a barely adequate shelter that couldn't protect them through a harsh desert winter or provide the foundation for building meaningful lives. Most importantly, their undocumented status left them vulnerable to detection, detention, and deportation at any moment, making any long-term planning impossible and keeping them in a constant state of anxiety and fear. Jake began researching legal options for helping his unexpected house guests, but what he discovered was deeply discouraging. The immigration system was so backlogged and complex that even people with strong asylum claims faced years of uncertainty and legal expenses that could reach tens of thousands of dollars per case. The women's lack of documentation from their home countries, combined with their method of entry into the United States, made them ineligible for most forms of legal relief. Even finding attorneys willing to take their cases would be challenging, since many immigration lawyers were overwhelmed with existing clients and hesitant to take on cases with limited prospects for success. The financial implications were staggering. Providing basic food, water, medical care, and shelter for 10 people was draining Jake's modest savings account faster than he had imagined possible. The cost of legal representation, if they could find attorneys willing to work with them, would be far beyond his means. And the longer the women remained hidden on his property, the greater the legal risks became for Jake himself. Harboring undocumented immigrants was prosecuted aggressively by federal authorities, and the sentences for conviction included not just prison time but the permanent loss of civil rights and eligibility for many types of employment. Yet despite these overwhelming challenges, Jake found himself unable to imagine turning the women over to authorities or forcing them to leave his property without a safe destination. They had become more than temporary house guests. They were individuals whose stories he knew, whose dreams he had heard, and whose courage he had witnessed firsthand. Elena's quiet determination to use her medical skills in service of others, Maria's fierce commitment to education as a tool for social change, and Rosa's unshakable love for the family she hoped to reunite with had all become personal to him, in ways that made abstract discussions of immigration policy feel inadequate and irrelevant. The transformation in Jake's own perspective was as dramatic as any of the changes the women were experiencing. His years of isolation and focus on personal financial recovery had left him cynical about human nature and convinced that looking out for himself was the only realistic approach to life. But watching these women maintain hope, dignity, and mutual support under the most challenging circumstances had begun to awaken something in him that he had thought was permanently buried. Their example was teaching him that resilience didn't require emotional detachment, that strength could be found in vulnerability, and that the most meaningful forms of security came from connections with others rather than individual accumulation. of resources. The women's presence was also forcing Jake to confront uncomfortable truths about his own country and its relationship to the global forces that were driving migration. The economic policies that had benefited him as an American investor were often the same ones that had destroyed traditional industries and agricultural systems in other countries, creating the desperation that drove people to risk everything. On dangerous journeys north, the lifestyle he took for granted, abundant food, clean water, reliable electricity, and freedom from violence, represented privileges that billions of people around the world could only dream of experiencing. This growing awareness of global interconnectedness was changing how Jake understood his role in the world and his responsibilities to others. The $10 investment that had started as a simple real estate speculation had become a window into the human cost of political and economic systems he had never thought to question. The women's stories were helping him understand that his comfortable life as an American citizen was built on a foundation of advantages and opportunities that were largely determined by the accident of his birth, not by any inherent superiority of character or effort on his part. As autumn approached and the desert temperatures began to moderate, Jake realized that decisions he had been postponing could no longer be delayed. The women needed winter clothing, better heating systems, and more substantial shelter if they were going to survive the coming months in the desert. More fundamentally, they needed legal status and the ability to move freely, work legally, and begin building the lives they had risked everything to pursue. The temporary sanctuary he had provided was valuable and necessary, but it couldn't become a permanent solution without destroying the very futures the women were trying to create. The conversations about next steps were painful and complex. Some of the women wanted to continue their journey to cities where they had contacts or family members who might be able to help them navigate the challenges of undocumented life. Others preferred to remain in the rural area where they felt safer from detection and where Elena's medical skills were desperately needed by the isolated communities scattered across the region. All of them understood that leaving Jake's protection would expose them to risks they had been temporarily able to avoid, but staying indefinitely would eventually destroy his life while failing to provide them with the foundation they needed for long-term success. Elena emerged as the group's spokesperson in these discussions, and her practical approach to problem-solving impressed Jake with its combination of realism and optimism. She proposed a phased approach that would allow some women to move on to other destinations while others remained to help establish a more permanent and sustainable arrangement. Her medical training, she argued, could provide the foundation for a legitimate business that would eventually allow all of them to obtain legal work authorization and begin the process of regularizing their immigration status. The plan Elena outlined was ambitious and risky, but it offered the possibility of transforming their temporary refuge into something that could benefit both the women and the broader community. She envisioned establishing a clinic that would serve the healthcare needs of ranch workers, small-town residents, and other immigrants who had limited access to medical care. The remote location that had made the shack an ideal hiding place could become an advantage in providing services to people who were themselves reluctant to interact with mainstream healthcare systems due to immigration status, lack of insurance, or cultural barriers. Jake found himself drawn to Elena's vision, but he also understood the enormous challenges it would involve. Establishing a legitimate medical practice would require licenses, insurance, equipment, and a level of capital investment that was far beyond his current means. More fundamentally, it would require transforming their current illegal situation into something that could withstand legal scrutiny and official oversight. The transition from hiding 10 undocumented immigrants to operating a legitimate business that employed them would need to be managed carefully to avoid triggering the kind of investigation that could destroy everything they were trying to build. But the alternative, watching these remarkable women disappear back into the dangerous underground economy that exploited undocumented workers while offering no path to legal status or long-term security, seemed even more unacceptable. Had witnessed their skills, their work ethic, and their commitment to helping each other and contributing to their community. He knew that any region would be strengthened by their presence, and that their exclusion from legal employment and social participation represented not just a personal tragedy for them, but a loss for the broader society that was refusing to recognize their potential contributions. The decision to move forward with Elena's plan required Jake to fundamentally reconceptualize his relationship to risk, success, and responsibility. The safe path would be to help the women move on to other destinations and return to his previous life of small-scale real estate speculation and emotional isolation. But safety, he was beginning to understand, was often an illusion, and the meaningful forms of security came from building relationships in communities that could weather challenges together, rather than trying to protect individual advantages through separation and exclusion. As winter approached and the first phase of their transition began, Jake reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since he had walked through the door of that $10 shack and discovered that his simple real estate investment had connected him to a global story of human courage, resilience, and hope. The women who had initially seemed like a complication to be managed had become partners in an endeavor that was teaching him more about strength, purpose, and community than he had learned in all his previous years of focusing on individual survival and success. The story of the 10 women and the man whose life they had transformed was still being written, but Jake already knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them as part of a community united by shared values and mutual commitment rather than as an isolated individual protecting his own interests. The $10 investment that had started as a simple business transaction had become the foundation for a life rich with meaning, purpose, and connection to something far larger than himself. And in the vast desert of Arizona, under the brilliant stars that had witnessed so many stories of human struggle and triumph, another chapter in the long history of American immigration was beginning to unfold.